that only animals compete with each other. But guess what? We're animals too, and humans compete for resources all the time. We just compete in a little different way. So let's think about on the subway. Okay, when you go into the subway, when we go back into the subway, competition for seats. There's a limited number of seats, and you have to get it. So you have to be kind of sly. You got to be like, okay, go in there. And if someone tries to like take a seat and you see the seat at the same time, then it's like this competition. You kind of check each other out, look at each other, like, okay, is it worth like I'm going to slide into the seat? So depending on how aggressive you are, depends on kind of how whether you get that seat. And it's also sometimes you don't have to say anything. You just look at that person like, oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Like that person's older than me. I'm gonna respect them, or that person's bigger than me, or that person looks meaner than me. And so you just kind of like walk away. So even right there, you're competing, you're challenging each other in silent competitions. Um, when animals fight other animals, especially animals of the same species, their competitions often are non-lethal, meaning they do a bunch of things to avoid actually fighting. Because if they fight, one or both of them could get hurt. Fish were like, and they like opened their mouths really wide. So before they started fighting with each other, both of them went like, and the other one went, and they went, and then they both looked at each other and they're like, yeah, I'm not scared of you, and I'm not. And then they're like, okay, you're not backing down. Let's fight. And then eventually one's like, okay, fine, I'll leave. Okay. So that's all because of competition, that fighting for resources. So what is the relationship between population size and competition? Well, as a population size increases, competition increases. That makes sense, right? So when there's only a few people on the train, everyone gets a seat. You don't have to fight for it. As more and more people enter the train, there's more people trying to use the same amount of seats. Competition for those seats is going to increase. So as populations get bigger, it's going to be harder and harder to get what you need to survive. And because of this, we see that if competition gets too hard, the populations might decrease. In nature, when you have an organism living in an area and there's very few of them and there's enough resources, the population is going to grow. So if we look at this population over here of P. aurelia, which is a microscopic kind of animal at the top, when we put the animals into the jar the first day, there's plenty of food, there's plenty of space, and so they start to reproduce. They reproduce, they reproduce, they reproduce, they reproduce. They reproduce because they reproduce exponentially, meaning one animal divides in half and creates two. The population rapidly gets big. But then we start to see something really interesting. At about day 8, the speed, the rate of population growth decreases. So you might see this from math. The slope over here goes from here to here. So what happens is at about this point, the population starts to get big enough that animals are starting to have trouble getting enough food. And so since they're not getting as much food, and because they're fighting more for the food and space that they have, less of them are able to reproduce. And so the the growth rate goes from this very, very high, and it starts to level off. It starts to go slower. And as the population continues to increase, there gets to be a point where the slope is basically zero. At this point in the graph about day 12, the population is not getting any bigger. It's not getting smaller, but it's not getting any bigger. It's capped out at this size. And the reason for that is in a stable population, as resources become more scarce, as there become less space, less food, as it becomes harder to get food and shelter and everything else you need to survive, fewer and fewer animals are reproducing and more animals are dying. And so what happens is the population levels off. It doesn't go higher, it doesn't go lower. In a stable ecosystem, it stays approximately the same because the same number of animals are dying as are being born. So what happens when I take two animals and I put them, two animals who have the same requirements, two animals that need the same type of food, the same type of shelter, that live very similar lives? What happens when I put them together in the same environment? Well, usually one or both of them goes extinct. So in this case, when I took the first population and I put it, at first they both started to grow. But then we see at about day 3, this population continues to grow and the other population starts to decrease until it's almost completely gone. So why did that happen? Why did P. aurelia increase and P. caudanum decrease? Well, I want you to think about it this way. Imagine that you had to go into school every day and you had to fight to get inside the door, and then you had to fight down the hallway to get to your classroom, and then you had to fight to get a seat, and you had to fight to get a pencil, and you had to fight to get a paper, and every time you tried to get a pencil or paper, you had to fight to get back to your seat. And you had to fight to get out of the classroom, and fight to get down the hall to your next classroom, and fight to get a seat in that classroom, and fight to get paper in that classroom and a pen in that classroom. You'd be exhausted, right? If you had to fight for everything all the time, you wouldn't have any energy to do anything else. And that's what happens between two species. When you have two animals that, or plants, that live the same life in the same way, if they're constantly fighting for everything, then either the strongest one is going to win and the weaker one's going to die, or they're both going to fight and die completely. So in this case, this species, P. aurelia, it won. It won everything. It outcompeted the caudanum. And so the caudanum population decreased and went extinct. And Aurelia's like, yep, I win, king of the hill. Bye-bye, loser. Okay? So competition can knock out other species. That's how strong competition is. And species are competing all the time for everything. They're competing with other species of the same type, and they're also competing with other species of different types. So they're interspecific competition, which means competition between two animals of the same type, and interspecific competition, meaning competition between two animals of different species. So do you think competition could be considered a limiting factor in a population? Definitely, competition could be a limiting factor. If competition is intense enough to limit how many organisms are in an area, then it would be a limiting factor. Anything that controls the size of a population is considered a limiting factor. So, how then do you get multiple herbivores living in the same area? Like, for example, giraffes aren't the only herbivore living in the savanna of Africa. There are elephants, there are gazelles, there are, I can't think of another herbivore, rhinoceroses. There's hundreds of herbivores that live in the savanna and they all eat grass. How can they all live in the savanna and fight for grass and all survive? Well, there's something called a niche. A niche is how an organism uses resources. It's the organism's job. So, for example, even though elephants and giraffes are herbivores, and even though they both eat plants and only plants, they eat plants in different ways. For example, giraffes primarily focus on getting leaves from the tallest part of the trees, whereas elephants will eat from bushes. And hyenas or rhinoceroses, here's my elephant, and rhinoceroses will eat the grass. So even though they're all eating plants, they eat different kinds of plants in different places. This idea that you can have organisms that need similar types of resources but use those resources in different ways is known as niche partitioning. The idea that if you change up how they use it, everyone can get what they need. So, for example, let's go back to you in school. Because we don't all go into the same classroom at the same time, because we switch it up and we only have some people using the classroom first period and then a different group of people using that classroom second period and a different group of people using that classroom third period, because we all use the same classroom but we use them at different times, we reduce competition because we don't have to fight for those desks. There's one for everybody. We don't have all 800 people using the same desk at the same time. This idea of using resources in different ways or at different times is known as niche partitioning, and it reduces competition. So here's a really interesting video about that.
It lives in fields, so it's a member of the field community or assemblage. Here it has many roles. First, it eats plants, so the rabbit is a herbivore. Some of the plants the rabbit eats might also be eaten by meadow mice. That makes the rabbit a competitor to meadow mice. The rabbit could also have parasites, such as tapeworms. That makes it what is called a host. The rabbit may be hunted by gray foxes. That makes it a source of food for foxes. The fox that eats the rabbit may get the rabbit's parasites. That makes the rabbit what is called a parasite vector. And as a parent, the rabbit may raise over a dozen young a year. So the rabbit reproduces rapidly and is a member of the field community, where it is a plant eater, a competitor to meadow mice, food for foxes, and a parasite carrier. All this helps determine the rabbit's place in the natural world and forms its niche. No two species have niches that are exactly alike. Each species has its own special physical characteristics and way of life that set it apart from all other animals.
So an organism's niche is how it's using the resources. And organisms are able to occupy different niches. So the niche that a rabbit occupies would be different from a bear. They both eat plants. They both have similar lifestyles, but because they use the resources in different ways, it reduces competition that allows them both to live in the same place. Another example might be a hawk and an owl. Hawks and owls both eat mice, but they eat them at different times of the day. So a hawk will hunt and eat mice and small mammals during the day, and then an owl will do the same exact thing, but they do it at night. So even though they eat the same food in the same way, because they do it at different times of the day, it reduces competition enough that they can both live in the same forest at the same time, because they both have different ways of using the resources, and so they occupy different niches. Okay, so tomorrow we're going to move on and we're going to talk about the other types of ecological relationships. Have a good day.